and welcome to episode 33 of Unlimited Hangout. I'm your host, Whitney Webb. Secret societies and the idea that some of them still exert influence on society is often outright dismissed or serves as a point of ridicule for those who are prone to label concerns about corruption, whether legitimate or illegitimate, as conspiracy theory. However, not all secret societies are really that secretive, and some have long been relatively open about their collective influence and their collective goals. It's worth reminding ourselves from time to time that sometimes examples of the worst corruption and depravity influencing our political systems can operate for years, hidden in plain sight, with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal serving as just one recent example. It could be argued that few groups of this nature have been as influential while also operating relatively openly than the Fabian Society. While much has recently been said about World Economic Forum chairman Klaus Schwab and his assertions that his organization has succeeded in penetrating, his words, cabinets around the world via the forum's Young Global Leaders program, this is a model that has been used and perfected by the Fabians and other groups as well for well over a century. In an effort to examine how other organizations aside from the World Economic Forum have sought to penetrate governments and nudge policies in their favored directions, often at the people's expense, the Fabian Society is well worth exploring, as they have definitively shaped major policies as well as many prominent and powerful political parties within the Anglo-American Empire and beyond. Joining me today to discuss the Fabian Society, their influence on Western imperialism and other policies, as well as how this group has informed our present situation, is Matthew Ehret. Matthew is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, a contributor to the media outlet Strategic Culture, and a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He is also the author of the books The Untold History of Canada and Clash of the Two Americas. Thanks for joining me today, Matthew. How's it going?
Hey, I'm very glad to be on. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, before we go back in history a century or two or so, I'd like to talk a little bit about current events first, since you are a Canadian living in Canada. And even though all eyes are now on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, not that long ago, Canada was dominating the headlines due to the Freedom Convoy, or the truckers, however you want to refer to them, and the Justin Trudeau-led government crackdown on that protest. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Canada right now and what impact you think the Freedom Convoy has had on life in Canada, both in the short and the longer term?
Yes, most certainly. And since we're talking about the global situation, indeed, there's different terms that have been used to label the Freedom Convoy, different things, as you said, truckers, Freedom Convoy. If you were Chrystia Freeland or Justin Trudeau, you'd call them Nazis and white supremacists. Of course, this was ironic because Chrystia Freeland was just found to have posted a picture of herself. I'm sure you've seen this, leading a march for a free Ukraine against the Russian supervillains of the earth, where she was holding a black and red flag associated with the worst, most virulent forms of neo-Nazism of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, which she had to then take down 12 hours after it was posted. But this is, a complete irony, which a lot of these technocrats are just completely incapable, I think, of self-reflecting upon the irony of Trudeau having bounced around his blackface, or Chrystia Freeland having met with Andrei Perubi, the one of the top neo-Nazis who ran the Ukrainian parliament after the US-led coup, and came to Canada and did photo ops with Freeland, with Trudeau, to arrange arms deals, and even Chrystia Freeland's own glorification of her grandfather, who ran the leading newspaper, Michael Chomiak, who led the leading newspaper in Ukraine during the World War II, that promoted Goebbels' propaganda and rounded up Poles and Jews for extermination during that time, which is proven completely. So there's a complete lack of ability to recognize irony, which human beings have endowed within us, this self-reflective ability to criticize our folly. These guys don't have that.
Some of us. Yeah, I think being a politician on the level with people like Trudeau and Freeland requires eliminating that and your conscience in the process.
Absolutely.
Maybe.
No, I meant the term humans in the best of terms, not what these things are.
Oh, okay.
as strange little Borg creatures who have something severed from within them at some point early on. I don't know when exactly that happens. I'm sure as children, as babies and toddlers, they had that potential to be really good people, but somewhere along the way it's crushed. But all that to say, yeah, the this was really in the top of people's radar for the past month until the Ukraine thing blew up. And I think that, what I've encountered is two extremes that I think are wrong in approaching the wake of the Freedom Convoy. On the one hand, you have many people who have noticed that a lot of the mandates across Canada are being repealed, pretty much a lot along the lines of what was being demanded by the thousands of people who I mean, I spent a day there. I had to see it with my own eyes because I'm not used to anything uh, revolutionary in an organic way arising in Canada, British controlled Canada. It's a zone of intelligence operations, and it always has been. So it was very difficult for me to actually believe that there was anything genuine in this originally. I'll be honest, but after going there, spending the day, talking to a lot of people, filming things, doing my own research, um, I came to the conclusion that yes, there's something very organic that was there. It was a very beautiful process, very peaceful, and I know that there is a lot there. Like people write to me and they say, "Oh, but you know that there were intelligence operations within organizers of the money raising operation, and or the fact that there was a certain type of psyop trying to paint the blockades that were used to justify the ultimate Emergency Measures Act that turned this thing violent and justified a violent clampdown to break up the thousands of people who had camped out in front of the Parliament for weeks. And it's like, yeah, there was no actual connection between the blockades and the actual Ottawa convoy. And I know that there were intelligence operations there, but there was something else. So on the one hand, I was saying that there were two different reactions that I disagree with. One hand, there are people who say it was all a big fake, just to distract us while they were doing other things that involved passing anti-hate legislation that's being rammed through with Bill C-36 to, broaden the definition of what hate speech is, in a very dangerous way, or, ramming through or advancing the momentum towards digital currencies. And yeah, these are things which are happening too. But at the same time, other people, I would also say it's not like that it's all bad in the sense that it wasn't all fully controlled because there was a victory indeed. And some people say, oh, we were victorious. We can go back to sleep now. We won. That's wrong. Just because mandates are being lifted. That's a false other extreme too. But I think that this became something more than the oligarchs themselves who were trying to manage this shit show. It became something more than they realized it wasn't. And, thousands and thousands of people all over Canada flocked in to give their support to this thing. Even now, there are thousands of people who I've seen pictures on social media, videos of people lining up on the side of streets. There's still people converging in the Parliament or in front of the Parliament. And across various provinces just to express their disdain towards the dictatorial turn that Canada has more overtly taken. So that's still going on. And obviously, there's also the parallel People's Convoy in the US, which is, I think, something like 70 miles long as it has just arrived in Washington. I don't know where that's going to go, but it's definitely something that has created reverberations for the good. Like, for example, the fact that you have had a coup d'etat inside of the Canadian Conservative Party. That was unexpected. The former head of it, Aaron O'Toole, was sounding far too much like a World Economic Forum freak, and he had an internal coup where he was ousted, and the conditions upon which the new leader of the Conservatives will be voted will be based upon the intensity to which they reject the mandates, but also the World Economic Forum broader narrative, which is quite good. So for the first time in a lot of years, we actually seem to have signs of a real opposition that I never saw in years and years. I haven't seen anything of a real opposition within Canada. Like I said, it's a very controlled environment. You also have a variety of other things too on the provincial level. A former premier, Brian Peckford, is taking the government to court over the abrogation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this guy is not just anybody. He was the former premier of Nova Scotia, but he's also the last living architect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms passed into law in 1982. So he's, it's a pretty big thing to have a person of that stature who's actually capable of speaking eloquently and with a strategic thinking in play. So those are good things. But like you said, there is a broader process happening that goes far beyond North America and has to deal, I think, with the breakdown controlled blowout of the financial system concentrated mostly in the transatlantic community, which is a giant bubble. Like, we used to have an economy many decades ago that had some viability to it, but increasingly since the early 70s, our economy has been turned into a giant, illusory, speculative bubble. And like all bubbles in physics, you can only blow them to a certain point before the physical boundary conditions are too much to hold the air within the bubble, and it pops. And financial bubbles are the same thing. Since the days of the tulip bubble of the 17th century, all the way to the present, there's been lots of bank runs, panics, speculative bubbles, and they've always been used as instruments of economic warfare by the City of London. It's not a new thing, although the scope and scale of it today, with global derivatives being what they are, something like 20 or 30 times more than the global GDP, it's a bigger bubble. We've got a lot more people amounting to almost 8 billion. That's popping. Like that's a lot of people. We've never had that many people. So the danger of suffering and pain is going to be a lot greater if it's not handled properly. And then there's the fight over what will be the operating system of the new system that will be brought online. And I think that's where we sort of get into the conditions around what is the broader geostrategic thinking from those World Economic Forum associated technocrats who also tend to overlap with NATO, the Atlantic Council, and all of these other think tanks over their fear of losing control during the context of the crisis that they themselves provoked. A bunch of the countries of the world don't want to sacrifice themselves, it seems, on an altar of Gaia. And so you have sort of a fight over two systems. And I think what's going on around China's perimeter, especially around Taiwan and the NATO of the Pacific that is being promoted, or the saber rattling by Shinzo Abe in Japan, who's doing sort of like a Zelensky. In the weeks before, or not even the week before, Russia began their military intervention into Ukraine, Zelensky came out in Munich and said, it is time, if we can't get into NATO immediately, we're going to use our nuclear reactors and technology to develop nuclear weapons once again, which the Ukraine got rid of in the early 90s. Japan, Shinzo Abe just gave a speech just the other day saying that Japan has to also develop nuclear weapons and change their constitution, which had forbidden the use of nuclear weapons since World War II. Ironically, right? Because they actually were the only country to suffer nuclear weapons use by the United States, but they've become since a U.S. colony with 50,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Japan as part of a forward-basing encirclement of China. So Shinzo Abe both said that, and in the same speech said that the U.S. military must defend Taiwan under all circumstances of Chinese invasion. Now, how you can invade your own country is a weird thing, since Taiwan's own constitution recognizes that it's also a part of China as an autonomous sort of province of sorts.
I don't know. Yeah. It seems like with this whole Ukraine thing, there's been all these whispers too that, this has emboldened China to move to Taiwan, and that'll certainly make things spicier than they are at present, I guess. But back to Canada. So you were talking a bit about the financial system to come, and the last thing I want to touch on before we move to the Fabian Society is what was announced by Chrystia Freeland, who is, I believe, both Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance of Canada, about this seizure of personal bank accounts for people that were deemed to be fundraising or donating, I guess in some cases, to the Freedom Convoy. So what do you think the consequences of that have been? Do you think people have, as a whole, sort of lost trust in the Canadian banking system? What do you see the consequences of that being, especially considering that Freeland announced her intention to make those measures permanent, though I don't quite know if she was successful in doing that.
She was not successful in doing it. That was the strange thing, because the utilization of violence, which is really, it was a violent crackdown when they came down on the protesters. That was justified, and also, the breaking of all the windows of the trucks, the forcing terrible fines onto towing companies that refused to tow the trucks. All of these things were done under the guise of the Emergency Powers, the Emergency Measures Act that was invoked for the third time. The first time in that form, but it had formerly been known as the War Measures Act, and it was used 3 times before that. Now it had not been made law, because to be made law, you have to get it passed both in the House of Commons. In British terms, that's a very elitist thing that's been created for Commonwealth countries. So it's the House for the commoners to have their representatives vote. But then you also have to have it passed in the Senate, which is sort of it's not the same as the US Senate. In Canada or a British Commonwealth country, the Senate is kind of like the House of Lords, where it's by appointment and it's by like 25 years terms. So it's like a lot of job security there. But it has to be passed in
it's like tenure.
both houses. Yeah, kind of like tenure, exactly. You can't really be fired unless they create scandal, which has happened a few times when senators have gotten a little bit too out of their script and too independently minded. There have been scandals created, like the one that destroyed the career of Max Harb. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. I don't want to get into that. But so it has to be passed in both houses. Now, what we found was that it was passed, though with a good deal of fight in the Commons. But when it came to the Senate, there were some incredibly interesting speeches from various senators that surprised me when I listened to them, where they basically called out the Official Secrets Act, because the information, the intelligence being used by the Anglo-Canadian intelligence agencies to justify this overextension of power was all kept secret. Nothing was made public. And we were being told, oh, you just have to vote on it because our intelligence agencies are so smart, and you have not been made a member of the Privy Council, and thus you have not been inducted into the, you haven't taken the oath of secrecy, which is another weird thing about Canada. You have oaths of secrecy that you have to, by law, sign on to if you're good at government. Yeah.
Sounds transparent.
So Canada's a pretty liberal democracy.
Well, a lot of people in the US, I think, have had sort of that impression of Canada that it's like a more, I don't know, a more utopian version of the US. At least I knew people sort of on the progressive side of things that sort of had that view of Canada a couple years ago. Not now, I would hope. But you
No, I
never
think
know.
that illusion has been destroyed for many. But yeah, I've known many people like that. I used to be like that too. I'm a lot of, especially Canadians, are trained to be anti-American and feel a sort of sense of righteous superiority because we, unlike the gun-loving racist Americans who have a history of bloodshed, we Canadians have been well behaved and never had to fight for our freedoms. And we just were wiser and knew that just by being well behaved, we would eventually get
Our
the mother
freedoms
country
from the
to just give us.
Queen.
Exactly. She would give us freedoms, and that's what happened. It's really detached from reality. But anyway, there's a lot of that. But like you said, the illusions come off. The thing with Freeland and Trudeau, Trudeau had said he wanted to keep these emergency measures in play for at least 2 to 3 months. Freeland had said similar things and said also that even after the emergency measures is removed, that she wanted to keep the right of having essentially deputized the big 5 Canadian banks and also credit unions. That gives them the right to freeze indefinitely anybody's accounts, business or personal, if they've been involved with either funding the Freedom Convoy, but you could see how that could just become anything that is displeasing to the ruling elite. Now, that didn't happen. As I mentioned, there were some speeches where it was coming to the surface that and nobody was really supposed to know that the information that was being used to justify it was secret. So it was getting loud and getting very uncomfortable. Also, I think there was a lot of bank runs. So they did freeze about 200 accounts. They jailed unlawfully about the same amount of people from the Ottawa region, some of whom are still in jail, like Tamara Lich. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name, but she was a leading figure within one of the, I think, more honest organizers within the convoy process. She's still in jail. She was not given bail. Benjamin Dichter, who was her fellow colleague controlling the money around Give, Send, Go and GoFundMe, none of which ever, as far as I could tell, seemed to have actually made it to any of the truckers. Again, far as I could tell, I haven't seen any evidence that it has. He was immediately given bail within minutes and basically said to his followers on Twitter that, by the way, I'm going to go take a vacation. Keep up the fight, bye. Whereas she is still stuck in prison. So it just shows you there are
not a lot of
weird shady
solidarity
things.
there, I guess.
No. And, you have weird things too, like, anyway, I don't want to get too off topic, so I have to keep myself on track. You were asking specifically about the emergency measures. So it was ultimately decided that that they were not going to go ahead with maintaining it. I think that they had a sense that it was going to possibly be voted down in Senate. There was a lot of fight back, more than they expected, and also a lot of bank runs. So a lot of people were pulling their cash. I know.
Yeah, I think that's probably why, to be honest, that it didn't get made permanent. They were afraid of the system, like too many shocks to the system. And like you said, the whole bubble, speculative bubble economy. I mean, that's not exclusive to Canada, obviously, but it makes it less resilient. Obviously, when there's shocks to the system, and a bank run is shock enough. And a lot of those preceded things like the Great Depression, things like that. Back in the day. So it probably wouldn't have heralded, I don't know, that could have created a crisis that they weren't ready to handle.
Yeah, it's all about timing, because they do
Mhm.
want that. They wanna blow the bubble out. That's been part of the agenda for a long time, and I
Right.
think that, they've wanted to really going back to even the first wave of the blowout that I would say began. It's not like the blowout is just happening now. I think that it really began in earnest in 2008 with the housing market blowing out in the United States,
Mhm.
and the whole system changed. It became a bailout system. And we
Different
started just having.
phases, yeah. I
Yeah,
think it's been
exactly.
a phased, controlled demolition, I guess you could say. Mhm.
Mhm, and it's very similar, like you said, to the Great Depression, where on a certain day in 1929, on a Tuesday, there was a broker call. All of the broker call loans were called in a coordinated fashion, where it was revealed that all of the brokers doing the stock purchases using a lot of shady means and overextending their themselves by getting loans they couldn't pay, um, all had to basically default, and that chain reaction default resulted in a mass deleveraging in the banking system, and the bubbles of the Roaring Twenties just immediately, popped. And the people who were on the inside, for example, the JP Morgan preferred clients list, the people who had insider trading information like Prescott Bush, there are very many people on that list that became public during the trials of the 1933 Pecora commissions. Basically, they were all able to sell before the bubble popped, and then they basically use their ill-begotten gains to just buy up for pennies on the dollar during the Great Depression. All of the assets in real estate, agriculture, farms, industries that had formerly been,
Right.
owned.
Consolidating capital in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And I think, well, like wealth transfers, right? Is
Totally.
essentially what these things are. And you definitely had that enter a new phase in 2008. And then you could argue pretty easily, too, that COVID-19, that whole affair that I guess we're still sort of in, it's hard to know anymore. It was another big wealth transfer. And then I would argue there's a final one soon to be underway when they want to introduce the new system in.
It's good to get into the mindset of evil. Like, people have to let their minds go there to just think through the really bad, like worst case scenarios. It's something to make real, because only this has only gotten so bad because people have been unwilling to think of the nature of evil intentions and its outcome, its effect, for too long. And, by ignoring this, it has, like, cancer just grown and overtaken so much of the host that there's very little good tissue left available to recover from. It's still there. Obviously, if, if it wasn't there, we'd all already be dead. Like, the oligarchy already would have achieved their desires a long time ago. And for me, like, that's always one of the best proofs for people who get a little bit too caught up into, I think, looking at all of the points of control of the oligarchy. And I'll just say oligarchy. I know people have different terms of what that means, but I'll just say oligarchy because I think your listeners all agree there is an oligarchy, and history is shaped by intentions for good and for bad. Um, but if they already had all of the power of controlling all sides of everything, then why didn't they already win? Why aren't we already dead, right? Is it just that they were bored and they've spent a few generations just playing around because they're bored? Or is there actually something that they don't control, something that is that they're afraid of even? Maybe there's weak spots, Achilles heels within the oligarchical structure itself, which have always been there, that we could appreciate a little bit more. And that's my contention, that there are massive points of weakness and fear within that system, which again you can
Sure.
get a better when you take a step back and we look at history from a broader standpoint, and we look at all of the points of failure where the New World Order came close, where they've wanted the New World Order to be successful in the 1919 League of Nations. They wanted that to be the thing that replaced nation states and created a one world supranational eugenics government, but it didn't work out that way. And they wanted it again in 1933 with their bankers conference to create a one world government. even before Hitler became like the main tool. That didn't work out. And then they tried it again, right? With the whole Anglo-American fascist, British fascist, Nazi machine that was going to like sort of carve up the world into these different, areas of fascist control on behalf of a financier oligarchical elite at the top. And that didn't work out. And then they tried again. So it's like, if they were that successful or that powerful, they would have been more successful, I think. So why do they fail? Why do they make these machines that tend to blow up in their own faces too, where they are then forced to sort of reorganize themselves and try again in a new, with maybe more virulent techniques?
Well, what we talked about just a few minutes ago, sort of like the consolidation of capital. I think in order to realize global governance the way they want to implement it, they also have to consolidate more than just capital. They have to consolidate control over institutions, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think, for example, in the case of the US after 9/11, they tried to implement a lot of things that they couldn't succeed in implementing programs like total information awareness. And there was a lot of complaints, for example, from the media about what that would mean for civil liberties. I think they also had to consolidate control over the media even further in order to sort of realize their ambitions, at least from their perspective, that they felt like they had to go back to the drawing board on some of that. Because I think a lot of people know too that consolidation in the U.S. at least got really excessive in the 1980s and has continued since then. But I think they felt like they needed to go after like individual journalists to an extent, and also like papers of record, media outlets like the New York Times that sort of have a global readership, even though they're US based and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, the New York Times has really just become a mouthpiece for the State Department and the CIA and all these other organizations. So I think they've been working to consolidate not just capital, but control over political institutions, control over NGOs, and that whole what people like Cory Morningstar call like the nonprofit industrial complex, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. In the
Yeah.
media, all these different sectors that they sort of feel a need to consolidate there. And I guess that brings us sort of to what I talked about in our introduction, this effort to consolidate control, I guess, over those institutions, different organizations, and people with shared goals and ambitions for global governance and other things sort of need, how does that consolidation happen from the perspective of those groups, sort of this penetration model that I referred to in the introduction. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess with that, maybe we should start our exploration of the Fabian Society.
Yeah, so the Fabian Society itself utilized just that very technique, as you just mentioned, what was dubbed permeation theory. To understand the Fabian Society, though, I think it's important to get at what is it and where did it come from. It is something which had really shaped and distorted, along with several other key top-down think tanks run out of London, the entire 20th century. And it was created at the end of the 19th century, which is a very important period. Now, utilizing this method of permeation theory that had been developed by people like Lord Bertrand Russell, a leading Fabian Society member, George Bernard Shaw, who was known as a literary figure, but really was a radical devout eugenicist. As all of these members, it's almost like a precondition for the most part. You had to have been a radical devout eugenicist in order to be a true Fabian. Um, there are many others. H.G. Wells, Lord Halford Mackinder, many people whose ideas went on to shape the paradigm of war and division and brutalization of the entire 20th century, including the push for a scientific dictatorship. These were all groups that organized themselves around the Fabian Society. There were different branches to it, in terms of an educational processing factory that was set up in the 1890s called the London School of Economics, which was sort of a zone created by Fabians with Rothschild funding to find talent around the world and process them in the halls of the Fabian, social engineers, and then send them back either to do work in Britain itself or in other parts of the world. The political party that was created in 1900 by the Fabians was known as the Labour Party. And the idea was to just simply do nothing less than completely uh, transform the entire foundation of society under a mass behavioral modification scheme and create a new type of humanity. founded on certain ideas located in the writings of Karl Marx, which themselves repackaged a lot of the core poisonous ideas in the Darwinian system of natural selection. That particular model, and there were many models. It's not like you have to be a Darwinian or a creationist that believes literally in the Bible.
Okay, so this is in Marx's writings that this comes from? Because I've never really heard, I mean, I haven't, like, read all
Yeah.
this stuff, myself, yeah. Just kind of familiar with the general stuff, but I don't really hear, people refer to, Marx's writings as sort of having that Darwinian, flavor to it. So which, can you be a little more specific about which bits you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. Like Marx described on Darwinism, he said that Darwin's work is most important and suits my purpose in that it provides a basis in natural science for the historical class struggle. He also
Huh.
devoted his first German edition of Das Kapital to Darwin. Engels, who was sort of Marx's handler, I don't think Marx fully understood. Kind of like Engels was to Marx what Thomas Huxley was to Darwin as Darwin's bulldog, right? His handler. Engels had written that Marx was, quote, simply striving to establish the same gradual process of transformation demonstrated by Darwin in natural history as a law in the social field. Now, whether that's true or not, since the Marxist view does postulate that there are these bursts, these periodic bursts of revolution between the proletariat and the rich, holders of productive enterprises. I don't know if Engels was being all that honest, but the fact that these guys were all basically trying to repackage some core ideas. And the idea of the Fabians was rather than do things the old fashioned way, which the British Empire had been doing for, I mean, it became really an empire in earnest in I think the early 1700s. Maybe I'd say even maybe with the advent of the Bank of England after the Glorious Revolution, which involved sort of the deep state of Britain taking full control, and whatever legitimate humanists and nationalists were in Britain formerly were completely destroyed at the end of that process with the death of Queen Anne in 1710 or 1714. But at that point, Britain really became the center control, the hive of this global empire, where it began a process of increasing colonization, the utilization of usury and speculation to undermine its victims. And that process was destructive oftentimes because it necessitated periodic wars, um, heavy-handed suppression when you had things like, for example, Indians in the crown jewel of the empire, periodically uprising for their rights and freedoms, and then you had to have the British go down and crush them and kill millions periodically just to put them back in their place. It got very messy, and it was risky for the empire itself too, because by having these wars, sometimes it risked the empire losing control of the system that they were trying to manipulate, or themselves getting blown up. So the Fabian Society method, which grew out of a group that was associated with a group called the Fellowship of the New Life, basically another group of British elites trying to create a new religion, a new type of, it sounds kind of innocuous on the surface, like they want a world where our spirits and bodies live in harmony, and a new world that could supersede the Judeo-Christian sort of matrix, utilizing a lot of theosophical Eastern, like a certain version of Eastern mysticism that they're fascinated by, which I don't even think is legitimately Eastern. I think that they're perverting a lot of it. But anyway, that was sort of what people like Alfred Wallace, who co-wrote or was given writing credits for with Darwin, of writing the Origin of Species in 1859. So he was a leading member of that group. And so out of that group came the more practical political aspect, which was the Fabian Society, just 2 years after the Fellowship of the New Life was created. And Beatrice and Sidney Webb were two among the many, as I mentioned a few of them already, eugenicists and social engineers who were like, okay, let's get rid of this old school, heavy-handed approach of overt violence to keep control of the empire, and instead let's use something a little bit longer term. Let's have a longer wave approach to history as we permeate slowly and we'll adapt ourselves and infuse ourselves into everything that has influence everywhere in the world possible, and we'll think increasingly transgenerationally. So we need to have more patience. So the term Fabian that they chose, and again, it was created in 1884, was based on the name of a Roman general named Fabius Maximus, who had developed a technique of attrition, basically destroy your enemy, not avoid head-on assaults at all costs, and just simply use attrition. So avoid war, use intrigue and subterfuge as much as possible, cause confusion within your enemy's ranks as possible, but slowly by attrition, when they're weak and they've used up all their supplies, then you can go and attack. You could lay it down. Part of one of the symbols that were crafted by George Bernard Shaw, who I mentioned earlier, was a disgusting rabid eugenicist who called for periodically forcing everybody in the world to justify their existence under a panel of population control, like a population control panel of
Oh my
experts.
God. Yeah. I can think of some people today who would love to institute that kind of system.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's a little bit too real when you listen to the writings of. Well, I mean, there's this one guy who's, I think, the first person. They call him Dr. Death, because
Oh,
he was the
that's
first person to do a.
nice.
It's I think he actually takes pride in it, but I forget his real name. But he was the first doctor to do a legal euthanasia in Europe in
Oh,
1996.
it
You
begins
heard
with a
about him,
K,
right?
doesn't it? I can't remember it.
Yeah, it's escaping me
It's right
too, but he
there.
called for this
Yeah.
horrific idea of, like, implanting everybody with some poisonous chip, like, that has a fluid that would kill you pretty quickly if
Mhm.
you cannot press a button at the same time every day. So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that way, if your neurological faculties ever,
If you
like,
start
went.
becoming senile, then you just die. Yeah. Mhm.
But yeah, so, these guys had this slower idea, but it didn't take off immediately. So that was one sort of, you can consider it an early think tank. And the thing, and another think tank that was created soon thereafter was, and this is 1884, right? The one that was created soon thereafter, in 1902, with the death of Cecil Rhodes, was the Round Table movement. Otherwise, it was funded by the ill-begotten gains of Cecil Rhodes, who had exploited Africa, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, for a long time, and was a real radical race patriot. Again, like all of these Rhodesians of the Cecil Rhodes ilk, who became controllers of his roundtable movement, like Lord Milner, Leo Amory, and there's so many other names. I'm not going to throw a bunch of names to your audience here, but they were all people who learned to be what they were as almost like a religious order of race patriots. They were all taught their work under the Boer War uprising, the Transvaal uprising that created the Boer War or the Second Boer War, where the innovation of concentration camps were created that focused on targeting women and children, to suppress the Transvaal Republic uprising of the Dutch and the Zulus. So these people were really cold-hearted, and there were a lot of these young sociopathic men all conglomerated around Lord Milner, who they were called Milner's Kindergarten. I'm saying both of these things because this think tank, which then created soon a scholarship program that basically looked for young talent all over the world to be brainwashed in the halls of Oxford. So they were centered in Oxford, whereas the Fabian Society, their school was the London School of Economics. Both schools had a niche, but they worked together. There's a lot of overlap. And the idea was, again, focus on the young, focus on the next generation, and try to create a civil service that was a little bit more manageable. Because the old school, before these organizations were created, the British Empire had a problem where they'd overextended themselves. It was a one world government in a sense, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire, and so this tiny little island was able to innovate a technique for many generations of controlling much of the world through very disgusting means. Malthusian population control, induced famines, divide and conquer, like all of these things were techniques of empire, and it required a huge bureaucracy. And so in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you see a lot of examples of civil servants who were appointed to be governors of regions in India, even in Canada and in other places, who they don't have a stomach for the type of bloodletting that they're expected to induce in the victim target population. A lot of them tend to, they believe the Bible. um, they believe that they have consciences. So the inner elite, the inner oligarchy, the upper level echelons didn't have the type of controls that they wanted to have over their civil servants, who again, would do things like call for the emancipation of slavery. There were actual fights in the British House of Lords in the 1830s and 40s, just simply saying, we should just get rid of the British Empire. We should just, it's not viable, and this is unacceptable to the elite. So they needed to like tighten things up a lot more. So the Fabian Society had this longer term, slow penetration approach. The British elite around Lord Milner, which was again a Rothschild funded operation. The Rothschilds put a lot of money into the creation of the Rhodes Trust and the Round Table movement. They tended to take on a little bit more of a old school burn the savages approach early on. Like, still, they didn't have the patience to do the type of evil that was needed. So what you tended to see was on occasion overlap. So there were organizations like the Coefficients Club that was again created by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, the two founders of the Fabian Society. They created the Coefficients Club that featured a lot of people like Lord Milner was a member. Lord Leo Amory, a roundtabler, was a member, even though so was Bertrand Russell, the so-called pacifist. H.G. Wells was a member. Lord Balfour, the guy who created the Balfour Accords.
Declaration, yeah,
Yeah.
for the creation of the State of Israel, for people that aren't familiar.
Yeah, and the theft of just all the lands of Palestine and the division up of Palestine by French and British imperialists. All of these guys were all part of the inner sanctum of the Fabian Society, as well as is this other thing. So like I said, there's a lot of overlap. And at one point, even I'm Canadian, and Canada was, and still is, I think, an important player right now at the moment in global affairs. So I'll just say this. One thing that's of interest here is that Lord Mackinder quit his job in 1908 at the London School of Economics, where he was the director under Beatrice Webb appointed him. And he's the founder of modern geopolitics, as it is known today, and as it is taught in Harvard and Yale and Oxford and other places, and as it is practiced since the Cold War, especially as this science of geography, which that's at the heart of many of our problems, is this quasi-science, which is not really a science. That's Lord Mackinder. The great game. I'll just say a word on this because people might not appreciate this. The great game of politics is organized around the assumption that hegemon must always come out as the dominant singular force, and the world is run by diminishing returns of resources and a fight for those ownership of diminishing returns of space on a finite area of the globe, right? And whoever can monopolize those resources can better induce the weaker to fight each other and stay subservient, enslaved to the master Hobbesian sort of dominant class. And there is a genetic racist tinge under the surface that I think you only are allowed to discover later on after you rise in the ranks. And a lot of Fabians, and I'll just say this now as well, a lot of Fabians are good people. They're not upper level. They don't know what the hell they're a part of. And people within the British Labour Party and a lot of the labor parties that were created by Fabians themselves are just people who care about the justice of the rights of labor against exploitative enterprises. They're not bad. Just I got to say that as a disclaimer because I don't want to paint the whole thing as like one blob. But when you get to the Jesuits, when you get to the upper level of the Jesuit order, there's lower level Jesuits who are really good people. They do a lot of good things, and then something happens along the way where you're periodically tested by your superiors, and no matter what your answers are at a certain point, as it gets weirder and weirder, whether you choose to drink the baby blood or not, you think that you've passed the test.
Oh my God.
I chose something horrific, but you think that you've passed the test, but you get two different sets of experiences at that point. It's a very Masonic sort of structuring. So I think something sort of happens there too.
It seems like something that's common in any of these secret societies that people like to discuss in the context of their influence on the world today. That there's the lower, I guess, to use Masonic terminology, like these degrees of initiation, these different these lower levels, and it's a lot of the nasty stuff that comes out from that researchers like you are able to sort of pull out aren't really apparent to these lower level members until they rise up in the ranks. That seems like something that's relatively common among these organizations, and is probably a structure that ensures their success, I would assume.
I think so too. Yeah. I mean, secrecy is part of the game.
Well, you also have members where people can be like, well, they can't all be bad, right? So like people that look at, I guess, the Fabian Society and are like, oh, so you're saying everyone in the Labor Party is a eugenicist? You know, you can use sort of reductionist arguments to sort of give yourself an additional layer of cover, maybe. And the same with, Masons and, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people oversimplify to the point of stupidity, and they miss the nuance, they miss the richness of actually how history happens by doing that.
Yep.
Um, on both extremes, right? The whole "I don't believe in any conspiracy" side of things, or everything is a conspiracy side of things, like
Uh-huh.
Fight Club version. Both sides, you miss all the drama. But like yeah, like these guys, like, and I'll get back to Lord Milner quitting his job, but like the thing about these guys, they profess themselves to be like socialists, and they utilize certain Marxist terminology and stuff, but they're really just they only they disdain the masses, they disdain labor. They actually are just using it as sort of like an attractive honey to attract people who are being abused in unjust economic systems, to conglomerate and weaponize thus groupthink, right? And utilize the masses in ways that really just justify a restructuring of the society with no benefit to the masses whatsoever. They ultimately want to create a system where there is a destruction of the means of supporting our population. That's why what we see occurring right now, just as a quick side note to Europe, um, there is an intentional destruction of the means of accessing viable energy sources today, which are needed to support life. Um, so-called dirty fossil fuels, because we have to decarbonize, or shutting down all of the nuclear power in Europe, which they're obsessed around. This has been a fight for like 40 years to shut down all nuclear science, and get everybody reliant on windmills and solar panels, because if you can get people dumb enough to think that windmills and solar panels can support 8 billion lives, then you've created a bunch of sheep that will willingly walk into the slaughterhouse. Like, you cannot support industrial civilization in its current form in any way that way. So what they're doing by like everything that they're doing right now, including also the destruction of means of producing food, it's
Yeah.
calculated to get effect. It's not like an accident. It's like that's the intention is, you know, and we're just so cut off mentally from understanding what is the science of. There's a science of supporting human life. It's accessible to everybody, but we're not taught that. We're taught instead these reductionist mathematical theories of thinking that you can measure quality of energy by calories or wattage, because like mathematically 1 gigawatt of windmill energy in a giant wind farm is mathematically equivalent to 1 gigawatt of energy from like a third or fourth generation nuclear power plant, occupying like a square block radius. But the quality of the energy is in no way the same. It's just the mathematical quantitative similarity. But qualitatively, you cannot like melt industrial steel. You cannot make a windmill with windmill power. Like it's different qualities of energy. So people have been lost. They've been cut off from the ability to think about quality first and quantity second in the dance, and they've put instead quantity mathematics as in the primary position, which was really at the heart of the battle over science. And this is why the Darwinians, that's why they liked the Darwinian approach, and of gradualism, because there was a sort of idea that when the Fabians adopted this idea of gradualism, instead of these leaps, these discrete nonlinear leaps that do happen in nature, that happens in evolutionary data. Like, we don't see examples of gradualism in the evolutionary fossil records. We just see like whole systems disappearing and new systems upgrading with these discontinuous leaps. We see the same thing in human economies too, where a new idea like the discovery of electricity wasn't a gradual refinement of the use of candle makers making better candles for lighting, and then all of a sudden electricity happened gradually. It doesn't happen that way. There is this creative leap, and it's this power that the human mind has that these guys have been, I think they've been really afraid of. They've been trying to obscure and destroy our ability to access these creative eurekas by saying that no discovery. They're trying to say that science is just randomness on the one hand. Like in the Darwinian system, one of the key assumptions is that the causal mechanism is random mutations on the very small that are just like rolling of the dice. And every once in a while you get lucky and it gives you a bigger claw that allows you to like eat out or beat the weaker opponents in your ecosystem for in the race for diminishing returns of resources, or like whatever, bigger, colorful feathers to have sex and propagate your genetic stock, or whatever. But it's all just a random function.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this gradualism that everything just slowly changes and adapts, but no creative leaps. So all that to say, both sides really advance, and there were other opposing views. Just to say quickly, at the late 19th century, it wasn't just the Bible or Darwin. There were many other scientists all over the world, like James Dwight Dana, the great American biologist, Karl Ernst von Baer, Cuvier. There are so many biologists who are looking at the processes of evolution and actually looking at questions of harmony, purpose, directionality, improvement, whether things are like moving in a certain qualitative direction of better or worse, like all of these things, how the parts all fit in a body or in an ecosystem together, in a harmonious rhythm. These were all ideas that were bearing a lot of good scientific fruit, and that was all crushed by this oversimplification that Thomas Huxley arranged with his X Club, which was sort of the first think tank in 1865 that was designed to just sort of promote Darwinism and synthesize all of the different branches of knowledge. So you had different representatives from different schools of math and astronomy and science and sociology, and they were all parts of this X Club. But T.H. Huxley was basically saying, okay, he arranged all of these debates between radical fundamentalist Anglican priests and himself usually, and he would just destroy them. And he got everybody in the papers and the newspapers and media to basically get across this fake idea that you have to be either one extreme, a total Darwinist and be scientific, or be a radical fundy Anglican who believes that the Bible is literally true. And there's no middle ground. There's no other choice. And too many people fell for that false dichotomy. But that was the value. So all that to say, I was going off topic, but the Fabian Society, they were working closely. So when Mackinder quit his job as director of the London School of Economics, he did so based on the job offer he got from Lord Alfred Milner, the head of the Rhodes Trust and the Round Table, which had basically a series of think tanks that they created all over the Commonwealth. And the idea was to restructure the British Empire, which was failing, and to create a new British Empire in the 20th century around either an imperial federation or what later became the League of Nations, which he was the guy who managed that. So he quit his job at the London School of Economics and he went to Canada on the dime of the Rhodes Trust. And both Milner and Mackinder were here in Canada for a couple of years trying to figure out how do they keep control of the British colony of the Americas, because all of the other American nations had rejected hereditary structures when they became republics. And, it was never a finished product, but Canada is the only monarchy of the Americas. And it was an important strategic beachhead by the British, a highly prized possession, because it was strategically located between the Russians and the Americans. So on the one hand, it gave, Canada's played a very negative role. This might surprise Americans maybe who are listening to this, and maybe Canadians might be surprised too. I would imagine they would be. Canada's been a beachhead of United Empire loyalists with an inner encrusted deep state embedded into our own Constitution from 1867, which was the thing that created Canada's Confederation. And it was done around a Privy Council office, a Privy Council, a Governor General, Lieutenant Governors. So these are the actual heads of state. It's not the Prime Minister, it's the Governor General. That's the head of state. All acts in Parliament have to be pass royal assent by the monarch or her representative. In each province, it's a Lieutenant Governor who's appointed to represent the Crown. It's embedded that way, and it always has been. Now, many of the worst acts committed by the British to undermine and destroy the rebellious colony that declared independence in 1776, a lot of this was done from basing operations in Canada. For example, British Confederacy Secret Intelligence had their headquarters in North America based in Montreal, provided with the St. Lawrence Hall, a big hall right down from where I live, which was where all of the key British Confederate intelligence operators were based, again, with the support of the British. John Wilkes Booth was up here for 5 weeks where he received his orders and money by the head of the Bank of Ontario, who later became the mayor of Montreal as a reward for good deeds to the empire in 1865. But he was given a check. This was found in his hotel room when he killed Lincoln. The killing of Kennedy, I mean, there's been amazing work done by Jim Garrison, the former district attorney of New Orleans, who had published On the Trail of the Assassins. And it sort of encapsulates 30 years of his own research into what was the real hand behind the killing of JFK. And this is the guy who Kevin Costner played in the Oliver Stone movie. But it was a real character, and his book is very real. And he demonstrates concisely that Permindex, run by Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, based in Montreal, was behind coordinating closely with the CIA and the British, the murders of JFK, also 2 attempts on de Gaulle's life. So there's a lot. And so I'm saying all of this just to get people to appreciate that the British didn't want to lose control of Canada, because at that time in the late 19th century, there were a lot of Republican, independently minded people gaining positions of prominence in Canada. I won't go through their names, but they're in my books. And they basically wanted to take the opportunity of the U.S. defeat of the British-funded Confederacy, because the British were also providing, kind of like the U.S. supplies logistics to ISIS mercenaries in Syria, right, or Iraq. That's kind of what the British were doing with the slaveocracy in the South, was they were providing weapons, battleships, money, intelligence to help them effectuate the war. And even there was a point where the British nearly joined militarily, openly, the Confederates' cause to break up the Union. But the thing that stopped them, and they were working with the French, with Napoleon III, was that Russia directly intervened, right? And Russia, under Tsar Alexander II, deployed the Russian Navy to the coasts of the USA in New York and off the coast of San Francisco. And it was a direct message to the British and to the French that if you do enter the war, it's going to be a casus belli with Russia. So stay the hell away. And that kept them at bay and gave Lincoln, Lincoln had some good advisors economically who educated him on the greenbacks and the emission of state credit through greenbacks that were not controlled by private financiers to build infrastructure and execute the war. So he had some serious international and national support. And that tipped the scales in favor of him. So Canada at the time, these nationalists who had, like I said, gained a lot of political influence, like Isaac Buchanan was a big player. Their figures in Quebec, they wanted it to basically have an independent, non-hereditary system of Canada. Some of them wanted at the time to join the USA. Others wanted to have a true republic. But the point is, none of them wanted to be a tool of the empire anymore. And that was scary to the empire, again, because look at the debates at the time. There was serious discussion to continue Lincoln's transcontinental railway that liberated the U.S. from British maritime controls of the oceans, which is how the British were able to, as a small island, to keep control of the global commerce, was getting everybody dependent on sea trade, right? So all of a sudden, when Lincoln finished the transcontinental railway, all of a sudden, the U.S. as a nation was no longer dependent upon British shipping, and they could develop internally and industrially. And that idea was going to extend through British Columbia and Canada. Well, it wasn't Canada yet, and into Alaska, which had just been sold by the Russians to the Americans, to the William Seward, the Secretary of State, who had survived his own assassination attempt the night Lincoln was killed. People forget about his Secretary of State, who got something like 18 stab wounds, and he survived. They're made of tough
high. Okay, wow, he's a tough motherfucker, for
yeah,
lack
he
of a
went
better
right back
word.
to work.
Wow, I mean, you survive
Yeah,
18 stabs. That's impressive.
might have been even more than 20, but he was the thing that saved him was that he had already, I think somebody had tried to kill him a week earlier by pushing him in front of a carriage that ran over him, and his whole body was in casts with metal girdings. And the assassin who came into his room to stab him couldn't get any of the essential arteries because of the metal girdings. And finally, William Seward's son heard the scuffle and came in and fought the assassin off. But this guy goes right back to work, and he's the guy who initiates with his counterparts in Russia the purchase of Alaska. And the idea was always to extend the rail and telegraph lines through Alaska, through the Arctic into Eurasia. There were broad programs for building the Trans-Siberian Railway with the help of American engineers that was going to connect into China with the Russo-China Railway. So many things. And the idea was that it was all going to be funded by national banks, national credit, kind of like what Lincoln had done with his 520 bonds or his greenbacks. That was all a buzz in nationalist circles all over the world, including in Germany, Otto von Bismarck, Sadi Carnot's networks in France, who was also assassinated in 1895 by anarchists run by Britain, all over Russia. I mean, Alexander II and III were, I mean, look at the people who were advising them. They were all part of the same international network in the Japan Meiji Restoration as well. You had a big fight over bringing national banking in with the help of these Lincoln networks. So it was a global. In Argentina, you had the Drago plan, the Argentinian foreign minister as well, to adopt the Lincoln policy for Argentina. So it was globally a real big point of fear for the British aristocracy and oligarchy, who were just seeing all of the core mechanisms they needed to keep their system in place disappear, with national governments going for full spectrum industrial economies, right? Where they could stand on their own 2 feet and not be reliant or dependent on a supranational private financier class or ocean trade. And upon that basis, you could have like fair trade amongst nations based on, parity, like, because we can all support our people. So we're not going to just have like cash cropping where one country just does, I don't know, cotton, and the other country just does shoes, or I don't know, like the way the globalization is wired. So this is where, okay, back to Mackinder. So Mackinder is brought in. He comes to Canada with Milner, and they set up a battle plan to keep Canada as a wedge controlled by the British between the U.S. and Russia, and that danger of a Russia-U.S. friendship. And the way that Mackinder, he lays out a whole battle plan, and that's in chapter 1 of volume 2 of my Clash of the Two Americas. Milner comes up with a plan, and he says, okay, of these 3 scenarios, and I'm paraphrasing his direct words. He's like, of the 3 scenarios for the future, the greatest threat to the empire is greater U.S.-Canada relations, which at the time, think in early 1900s, the USA was very different from the USA we have today. So at the time, when you had our prime minister then was Wilfrid Laurier, he was a Republican. He loved Lincoln. And he finally became prime minister of Canada. And he fought against the British on a variety of things. Also, he was trying to stay alive. It was the age of assassinations too, right? It was not easy to be an independently minded thinker and stay alive if you had political power. So he had to navigate through some crazy Byzantine shit. But nonetheless, he finally got his bill to have what's called the Zollver, or a customs union of North America, with a protective tariff around Canada and the United States, and industrial growth with large-scale productive state credit emissions internally within the continent, which was very different from NAFTA, because people hear that on the surface and they're like, that's like NAFTA. That's a corporate takeover. And it's a very different thing. It was based on sovereign nation states cooperating together based on a large-scale growth program. NAFTA did the opposite. It destroyed our industry. It destroyed our manufacturing. It did the opposite. And anyway, so what Milner said, okay, that's the greatest threat, is closer U.S.-Canada integration at the time. The best scenario is greater British-Canada integration around a world government, which was the roundtable sort of idea of a world federation. But that's not likely going to happen, he says, because there's too many nationalists in Canada who are still resisting. And he said the middle ground, the happy middle ground, is the promotion of a synthetic Canadian nationalism. Because he says, like the Canadians are happily ignorant happily ignorant to the longer waves of history. And this is one of the best qualities of the Canadians, because they don't know, and they think they know. They're bumptiously superior. They have a feeling of bumptious superiority to the Americans, and we can use that to inflame a sense of Canadian nationalism that is in harmony with British interests. And that's what became the next 110 years of British policy in Canada, was creating a false Canadian nationalism without a British flag, which is what we had back then. And, like a Canadian flag with a big maple leaf that didn't mean anything. But one of the other things is that he arranges the ouster of Wilfrid Laurier. So in 1911, just as this bill is passed in the House of Commons and the Senate to be made law, at the same week that it's about to be made law, this customs union, Wilfrid Laurier is ousted in a orchestrated coup that's run by, and I've got a paper that's on my website documenting this thoroughly, is the Round Table movement that had their headquarters in Ontario. The Orangemen, something like 1 out of 3 males above the age of 20 in Ontario in the day were Masonic Orangemen, part of the Orange Anglican Order affiliated to the monarchy, and some networks of traders in Quebec around Bourassa, a guy named Henri Bourassa, fake nationalist. So Wilfrid Laurier is quickly ousted. He loses power, and he writes to his collaborator, Odie Skelton, who's another nationalist, a really good guy who dies in a mysterious car accident when he's doing battle with a lot of these Rhodes scholars in 1940, trying to keep Canada out of the British War. But Odie Skelton, he writes a book where he describes the letter that Wilfrid Laurier sent to him, where Laurier says in 1914, Canada is now run by a group in London called the Round Table that controls both the Liberals and the Conservatives. We've been taken over. And this Round Table movement at the time, in Britain, they are working on their own coup d'etat to take control because the Fabian Labour Party has their guy, Herbert Asquith, who's a little soft in the presidential or the prime ministerial position. Now, they have just orchestrated a war using a whole set of secret military alliances. I'm sure a lot of people have read about this. But the World War I was an orchestrated war. It did not have to happen. There's no reason why World War I happened except for these back-channel British military alliances, and also a series of assassinations that unleashed a series of unfortunate consequences that resulted in, what was formerly a skirmish between Serbia and Austria. It became very quickly, all of these military alliances were activated, where all of a sudden the world was pulled into a meat grinder for 4 years. So Herbert Asquith was not the man for the job, Milner thought, and he worked to create what's called a very British coup. There's a paper, a wonderful extensive paper. If people just type in a very British coup in Google, I think they'll still get it, Lord Milner. And he basically ousts Asquith and takes control with his whole coterie of Leo Amory, all of these other guys who also worked with the Fabians in the Coefficients Club. Like I mentioned, it's not different things. People treat them like they're different, but they're not. And they then wanted to create the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the post-World War I terms, to shape the New World Order, which became, out of Versailles was the League of Nations was created, the British Chatham House, the what's called the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That was created in 1919. And also the unpayable debt payments that were designed specifically to break Germany completely, create hyperinflation, which has a lot of parallels in many ways to what's happening today, and then use the effects of chaos of hyperinflation to create a new type of currency with a new type of fascist governance. So people basically had to, at a certain point in 23, Germans had to bring in their wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks, because it cost you, everyone became a billionaire and people were like burning money to stay warm, and it lost all value. So people were told, okay, just bring in your wheelbarrows of money. We'll give you a new type of currency called a Rentenmark, and it will be tied to new rules that involve breaking unions, destroying unions, getting rid of government jobs, all sorts of things that would only be accepted under fascist imposition. Democratically, people wouldn't accept that. And the guy who wrote that was an associate of the Bank of England's Montague Norman, who ran the Bank of England for like 25 years. And his name was Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht became Hitler's finance minister. And he was the guy who invented the Rentenmark's so-called solution to the controlled crisis. He was also a member, with Mussolini, of an organization called the the Pan-European Movement, the Pan-European Union, in 1922, as a way to promote a benign feudalism onto the world. That's literally what they wanted. Count Kalergi von
Benign
Kuttenhoff.
feudalism. What do you mean by that?
I don't know what they mean by it. I think
That's their term then.
That's their term. I would
Oh,
never.
okay.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
well, I
Benign
think
feudalism.
everyone that wants to impose feudalism or neo-feudalism today, if as long as they're not like the peasant class and they're the elite class, I'm sure they see it as benign.
Yeah. If you're part of the parasites, then yeah, I'm sure. If you're the ones getting the actually suffering from the cancer, then you don't see it as benign if you're gonna yeah. No, exactly.
Think it's a
Um,
issue of perspective. Anyway, go on. Sorry to
no,
interrupt.
you're right. Absolutely. And it's never, I mean, these guys, like I said, it's like for them when they talk about socialism, they're and like state control of all assets, which is what the Fabian Society was designed to do, was to basically, create a state control and then a redistribution of all wealth of all assets, all private property around an idea of justice. It attracts a lot of poor people who have never had much and who have been abused. And the reality is, those who are promoting that policy, they don't. They just want to create feudalism. They don't. They don't. For them, the word when they say the word socialism, when Bertrand Russell says that, he's actually saying feudalism. You'll all be equal, but you'll all be equally either poor or dead. Um, and that's sort of like, yeah, what these guys kind of want. And so Hjalmar Schacht, that was the whole thing that he was a part of. People like Otto von Habsburg ran this thing for like 40 years, the pan-European movement. In fact, he created another organization called the Dignitas Humani Institute with a whole bunch of other black nobility upper-level figures run out of an old, creepy monastery, 800 years old. And the head of this organization is none other than, I'll just say it, Steve Bannon. That's who they brought in to run this thing, to unite the movements of the right. It's super weird when you go to their website. But yeah, it's basically to repackage Clash of Civilizations for a alt-right sort of audience. Um, anyway, it gets weird. But all that to say, so that's what the Roundtable movement wanted to do in controlling the terms of the post-World War I age. And the League of Nations was always done with a collective security pact that they embedded. So people like Lloyd George, who was part of the Roundtable, he was prime minister. Milner was the controller of all foreign policy. Leo Amory was in there. Anyway, it was a Roundtable run government. What they wanted was this Article 10. That was a key thing of the League of Nations, of a collective security pact, kind of like what they did for NATO in 1949 later on with Article 5. That's the World War III clause. Basically, if any member gets in a skirmish, just or unjust,
Right.
everyone is obliged to enter into the fight. So also it called for getting rid of nation states having any influence over their military or economy. So it was really just a cover for world government. Bertrand Russell, who's a known pacifist, or that's how he's celebrated, he actually wrote saying that, he supports, his ideal is global anarchism as a global philosophy to get rid of nation states, because these guys are all wanting to get rid of the sovereign nation state institution forever. That's the main goal, is destroy that. But at the same time, as Bertrand Russell says, yeah, like the anarchy of Prince Kropotkin is like the ideal. What we really want to get people to is the League of Nations, as again, this is where you get into this like benign sort of feudalism, right? The thing that maintains the order of the system of local chaos, local mini control, is this global system of structure of world government. And even Friedrich von Hayek, who's a big Austrian school, libertarian, known for protecting individual liberty and freedom. In the end of his Road to Serfdom, even says we need to have a world government police to make sure that all of the local regions of the world all play by the same rules of the game. So it's like there's something fishy going on regarding how these guys are talking about local freedom or personal liberty and stuff. There's a sleight of hand happening here. Bertrand Russell, again, Fabian Society, high-level Fabian Society figure. So, this doesn't work because at the time in the 20s, in the United States, even in Canada, you have the Laurier. Laurier is dead, the prime minister who was ousted, but his Laurier Liberals, his whole team, ends up coming back into power, and they fight off in every single League of Nations conference. They're battling with these imperialists, saying, no, we don't want to give up Canadian independence. You have the Irish Free State of Michael Collins and that group as well. They're part of the Commonwealth Federation conferences. and they're fighting again for their right to have national independence from this global empire way of thinking. And you also had in America, in the United States, you had Warren Harding, who was the president, sort of the last, I guess you could call him Lincoln Republican, who died by oyster poisoning on his way back from Alaska in 1823 or 1824. I forget. But anyway, he died under very mysterious circumstances. But he was also a big part of the nationalist currents in the U.S. from both parties, who were all fighting against this world government idea. And there was a better understanding of the Wall Street fifth column penetrations by Britain that had been embedded since really 1776. There had always been this deep state fifth column that had never left after 1776, but reconfigured themselves within the U.S., the heart of the U.S. itself, just like they did in Canada. And so there was a better understanding, and people fought against that and pulled the U.S. out of a lot of the agreements that, they need. The U.S. was a big player even then, and they needed to have the U.S. on board for this to work. So even though Warren Harding died, and there was something like 300 German statesmen who also were assassinated by mostly London-directed anarchist cells of terrorists between 1921 and 1924. A lot of Russian statesmen had died before the Bolshevik Revolution as well, funded again by Alfred Milner, Jacob Schiff, Max Warburg from 1905 all the way to 1917. You had tons of London Wall Street money, including, like I said, $20 million from Lord Milner put into the different Trotsky, Bakunin, Jabotinsky camps of anarchists, starting in, again, 1905, to disrupt the nationalist movements of Russia that were still trying to keep alive the fires of industrial development and progress that had been adopted after Lincoln's victory in the Civil War. So there's this whole network that ran a color revolution. It didn't, anyway. So it's the same network, though. You find the round table hand, the Fabian hand, all over the place. And so that didn't work. Then coming through the, again, I'm Canadian, so the actual legitimate nationalist Canadians were continuously fighting against this thing. And the Fabian Society of Canada was created in 1931 as a think tank first, as a way to solve the Great Depression. And, that's something which I read about it a little bit in that paper that you published on Unlimited Hangout on Like Father, Like Son, two generations of dictators in Canada. But this Fabian Society think tank, the idea was, look, the Great Depression was devastating people's lives. There was a lot of ignorance, fear for the future, and in that type of climate, people are ripe to support things they would never support if things were stable and they had security and knowledge and confidence. So there is a tendency of like blaming others, blaming other races for all of your problems, blaming other, the idea of look at all the money we're spending on keeping poor people, housed, or keeping mentally defective people in an institution. It's so expensive when your average, white Anglo-Saxon family is starving and they're not feeding their families because there's no jobs. Isn't it wrong that our government state money or taxpayer money is going to keep people alive who are not worthy of life? And so eugenics, funded always by, as the science, the sort of social application of a lot of the Darwinian mechanisms of the survival of the fittest, but to human terms, that's fake science was really becoming popular. And again, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Macy Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, many other Anglo-American intelligence operations masquerading as as foundations were funding this fake science, including the science in Germany, which was a little bit more enthusiastic to adopt it. But it was still being adopted by 32 American states.
Yeah.
Was adopted sterilization and eugenics policies. Canada had Alberta, BC by 1933, sterilizing over 10,000 people who were not deemed morally fit to keep alive.
Yeah, I mean, there was even that Supreme Court decision in the U.S. where I forget, I guess it was the head justice at the time, I forget his name, basically said like 3 generations of imbeciles is enough and ordered, 3 generations of the same family, the women to be sterilized. I mean, a lot of people forget that. Anyway, In in the interest of time, we could definitely, I could definitely have you talk, I guess, for a couple hours. Then tracing this all the way from where you have taken us, to the present. But let's jump ahead for a little bit.
Before we jump ahead, just one punchline. So this Canadian Fabian Society, here's the punchline, was set up by 5 Rhodes scholars, all pushing eugenics, and they created a political party called the Commonwealth Cooperative Commonwealth Federation as a political branch, which became relabeled in 1960 as the National Democratic Party, the NDP, and leading members of it, like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and all of his London School of Economics Fabians, who were embedded in the Privy Council office in the 1950s, and were all basically first assigned to destroy any remnants of Christianity in Quebec, which was a Christian base of operations, which was pushing back heavy against eugenics, as well as the teaching of Darwinism as an absolute fact in schools. The idea was to destroy and dismantle any type of Christian influence in Quebec, which is what his main assignment was and what he did very well. And I write about that in the book and also a bit in that paper that's on Unlimited Hangout. And that entire network basically retooled themselves over when the surviving nationalists died off, like C.D. Howe and many of the Quebec liberals, or the Canadian liberals, when they were ousted, they basically, like a virus, took over a host cell because they couldn't get political power as the Orange NDP, and they basically permeated the Liberal Party. And that's where you had the creation coming out of 1963 of a new national anthem, a new Canadian flag, and a new idea of Canada as something not British and somehow independent, where Pierre Elliott Trudeau was propelled to become quickly prime minister under a selection committee run by Maurice Strong, who was then controlling Power Corporation, which was the biggest sort of the monopoly on electricity in Quebec. It was a Rockefeller operation in many ways. So he was a selection committee that selected Pierre Elliott Trudeau, made him prime minister, and if you look at it from that standpoint, the entire technocratic regime change was sort of a technocratic cybernetics revolution in 1960 in Quebec, and then in 1968 to 72 on the federal level was affected by these Fabians masquerading as liberals in Canada. And a big part of that utilized the execution of martial law in Canada. As people know, in Quebec, there were tanks on the streets for a month under the October crisis. And it was the previous period before Justin Trudeau utilized the Emergency Act that it was used, where the remnants of opposition to this type of technocratic regime change, this overhaul of governance, was completely destroyed. The deputy prime minister of Quebec was executed in that operation, which, as I go through in that paper on your site, was run by the RCMP, or a division within the RCMP Special Operations, which has tied itself to British intelligence. And the whole thing, from the FLQ terrorist bombings throughout the 60s, all of the cells of these terrorists, evidence has come out irrefutably proving that these were controlled by Anglo-Canadian intelligence from the get-go. Trudeau the first was always in on it. And the idea, was always to just justify the transition of a type of society centered around material growth, the development, the development of the capacity of people to be better, to have a better life for their kids than their grandparents did. That was always the ethic of society, and to liberate human beings from empire. That was changed to a save nature, save ecosystems from humanity. And humanity became increasingly defined as a virus or a cancer on Gaia, on this natural, pure equilibrium thing. And so this is where we get the founding of things like the World Economic Forum, which was co-founded by Maurice Strong, the Canadian oligarch, who also co-founded the first United Nations Conference on Population and the Environment in 1972. He's the guy who created sort of the foundation, or the structure. At least he's the figurehead. He's kind of like a Cecil Rhodes character. He's not a causal nexus unto himself, but or like a George Soros character. You know that type, right? Upper level management, but ultimately kind of disposable. They're sociopathic and they do a job well, so they're used as mercenaries. And if they're if they want to have kids, their kids are guaranteed sort of, a hereditary mercenary set of benefits, like the Bronfman dynasty or something. So that's what Maurice Strong was. He didn't want to have kids for obvious reasons, but that's another thing. But so these guys, he puts out a plan to get rid of nation states in a more virulent way by saying we're going to have an NGO complex instead of trying to solve the big problems of the world the way people like Martin Luther King Jr. were talking about with his call to conscience in 1968 and his battle plan for ending imperialism in the Vietnam War, or Bobby Kennedy when he was running for office in 68. He had a whole program to really get rid of slavery and economic slavery, as well as hunger, all of this stuff, by building big industrial projects for Africa, getting rid of the power of the CIA within the military, and all sorts of things. So instead of thinking about big solutions, let's instead have NGOs litter the landscape, offering little micro solutions to, like, pay money to build a well, like give people small little things that diffuse their energy, while the actual controllers, who are part of the coterie he's setting up with the Davos crowd, right, under Klaus Schwab, his student, who's also a student of Henry Kissinger, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Henry Kissinger being a student of William Yandell Elliott, as who's the roundtable controller in Harvard. He's a Rhodes Scholar himself, Yandell Elliott, and Henry Kissinger is also part of this nexus of young sociopathic boys, kind of like a Milner's kindergarten, but in this case, you'd call it Yandell Elliott's kindergarten. Pierre Elliott Trudeau is also a student of William Yandell Elliott in Harvard too, before he's sent off to the London School of Economics. So, like, all of this stuff is a recapturing, a destruction of any legitimate currents of U.S. Republican constitutional nationalism that were being reflected by assassinated American presidents, of which there were 8 who died while in office, the last being JFK. But then again, his brother was, I think, a factor. He was going to become president, guaranteed. And the replacement of the recolonization of the USA by this supranational oligarchical clique of feudalists. That's sort of what happened.
Right. Wow. Brilliant summary. You took us through I don't know. I don't even know what to call it. An abridged version of the untold history of the past, like, 200 years or so. That was pretty cool. So I guess since we started, and you sort of mentioned a bit about, I sort of in the intro mentioned the World Economic Forum, Young Global Leader program in the introduction. You sort of mentioned the World Economic Forum here. It sort of seems that, the WEF and some of these other organizations as well seem in some ways to sort of to be carrying the torch, I guess you could say, from the Fabian Society in the past. Would you agree with that assessment?
100%. Yeah, it's the exact same model. The Fabian Society and the Roundtable movement with their Rhodes Scholarship program created a sort of model which has been replicated on other levels. There's other scholarship programs. There's a Massey Scholarship Fund. There's all these things that sort of utilize the same model, and definitely, I would say you're totally right. The World Economic Forum Young Leaders Program is very similar as an indoctrination process of taking humans or people who had human potentials, turning them more Borg-like, and then reinstating them back into positions of influence in their local regions.
Well, I think it's also a way to sort of not just sort of brainwash these people, but sort of like buy them in a sense, and be like, if you follow what you learn here, you will go far in life, i.e., you will be allowed to advance undeterred in our controlled system. Something like that, right? I do want to say, though, that a lot of the focus is on the Young Global Leaders program currently in independent media, but there's a lot of other programs like you've talked about today. That sort of have the same role. And really, a lot of these quote unquote philanthropists, I don't know, like Michael Milken has sort of his own scholarship program. Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone Capital has his own that's based in China specifically, and focused sort of on this transnational network in which he moves a lot between China and the US specifically. I think there's a lot of different ones I guess over time have sort of taken on more specialized roles within the, I guess, global oligarchy.
George Soros has one called the Institute for New Economic Thinking that was created in 2007. and the former head, Jim Basili, who is the head of basically the Canadian Chatham House at the time, the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, or the CIC. It's now been renamed the Canadian International Council. They do all these anyway. It's a liberal think tank, but it's essentially the Chatham House of Canada. The U.S. version is, by the way, I didn't mention this, but the U.S. version is what Hillary Clinton calls the mothership, the Council on Foreign
The
Relations. That was
mothership.
yeah.
Yeah.
um, but that was set up in 1921 to, they couldn't call it the American Institute for International Affairs because I guess it would sound a little bit too obviously part of the Rhodes operation. So they
Yeah.
just called it CFR, but it was always staffed by Fabians and roundtablers. Like even today, Richard Haas, who's the president of the CFR,
Mm-hmm.
is himself a Rhodes scholar, virulently. And so that was the British penetration in the U.S. But yeah, George Soros, his Institute on New Economic Thinking, it has scholarship programs, and it is designed also with his open society universities to do this pretty much same thing, to criticize the dysfunctional neoliberal order that everyone can agree did tons of damage. So it's very attractive to young people who see the damage done to the world, to the ecosystems, and to humanity over globalization's period, right? From the early 70s, especially. So it's very attractive to young people who want to have a future. So there, it gets good kids into it, who are creative. And the idea is to give kids the space, young people who have talent, the space to just create new economic systems. But, and here's the trick, George Soros says the two inflexible rules that everyone has to adopt when they're creating whatever type of system they want to create, obviously it's going to have a predetermined outcome because of these two assumptions, is that individuals are fundamentally organized by irrationality. So chaos on the small, kind of like think of the Darwin random mutation mechanism on the small. And on the large, he says the need for maximum stability and the belief in entropy as the macro system. So the law of entropy is essentially a theory that all systems, whether ecosystems or human body systems or the universe, even like galaxy, or like it's a pretty comprehensive theory. It's an assumption that they're all organized around thermodynamic equilibrium, that all systems that seem to change are all being changed in accordance with a state of no change. That ultimately, like a gas engine in your car, you put the engine in, you make the pistons run as you heat it up, right? And you're burning the fuel. That fuel is always moving towards a point of no fuel. In the gas, that engine is not going to produce more fuel, no matter what you do. It won't redesign itself to burn fuel better. It's an engine. So what these guys said is that's the rule for everything that they extrapolated to the universe. Even as far as justifying this assumed idea of a heat death that's going to happen supposedly at some point, a few billion years or trillion, I don't know, hundreds of billions of years in the future. Human beings are all like that. Ecosystems are all like that. And if you believe that, and again, it's mathematics. It's not, the universe shows us, in fact, that it's doing the opposite. What we see is things moving from lower orders of potential to higher orders based on creative directionality. That's what evidence is showing us. That's how we went from like apparently single-celled amoebas to being like these complex creatures interacting over electricity, you and I, thousands of miles apart, talking to each other cognitively around ideas. So to say that was all a random function governed by no directionality and no perfectibility is insane. It's not scientific, but this is what he's saying. Everyone has to assume those two mechanisms: irrationalism by the individual players in the system, and the need for total stability and entropy in the whole. And that's where this is where the technocratic social engineers can create what they say is a science of management of diminishing returns, and deciding who gets what in this world that is perpetually getting smaller and smaller under a Green New Deal of windmills and solar panels and reduced food production. And this is why I think they're afraid of what you're like. There are fifth columns, in Russia and China and in India. There's obviously deep states penetrating all countries of the world. There's no pure country as such, but these are countries that through their policy actions over the past, especially 20 years, I could see clearly that they don't want to sacrifice their multi-thousands of year civilizations on this altar at this point. So they're fighting, I think, for survival. And the fact that they're not playing ball and staying in this cage that's going to be lit on fire, the way they were supposed to a decade ago, is, I think, part of what is pushing this new Iron Curtain, this intention to try to provoke an excuse to erect a new total absolute Iron Curtain between East and West, while the oligarchy tries to consolidate their situation, their power in the part of the transatlantic bubble that they want to blow up. But the other parts of it aren't really as on board as they used to be. So I think there's this fight right now of what that's looking.
I agree with you to an extent, but I definitely think that countries like Russia and China remain very committed to the fourth industrial revolution within their own countries. I think they see that as being in their national interest, at least from their leadership's point of view, as a way to sort of dominate in the era to come of artificial intelligence, things like that, because they're definitely very invested in those technologies and in setting the rules, sort of the groundwork for their for those new technologies as they're being rolled out, particularly artificial intelligence and things like that. And really, I would argue when people talk about the Great Reset, it's sort of this effort to make everything digital and digitize everything. Essentially, like all sectors of the economy and society. And I think Russia and China, their leadership definitely are doing that. And I think they see it as a way to sort of keep their domestic populations under control. So I don't really see them, I guess, as white hats in that sense. I see them more as, they're trying. They're on board with that aspect of things going on, but they sort of want this multipolar world order, which I talked about in my last podcast. With Ian Davis, where they sort of see the different, countries having a more equal piece of the pie, not really having a hegemon and a regional bloc really being one hegemon necessarily, but ironically, they're sort of a Eurasian bloc uh, themselves, so it sort of may still be a bloc controlled system, but just a different, I guess, flavor of sorts. You're welcome to disagree, but I definitely think that Russia, I've done some podcasts about this recently, have adopted some technocratic technologies, or at least major players in their power structure are working to advance that right now, like in Spurbank and some other
Oh yeah,
groups.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Is totally poison. Yeah, for sure. And the central bank of Russia as well is super poisonous, full of vipers and yeah, I mean, personalities who were installed really in the 90s during perestroika, the big rape of Russia. A lot of these figures are still there as IMF directed Borgs. And yeah, the World Economic Forum has all sorts of assets around spare banks, controllers, embedded all throughout the landscape for sure. China as well has their own thing too, like Jack Ma as well. He's a World Economic Forum trustee, the Bill Gates of China.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um,
The
and I
Alibaba
mean,
guy. Mhm.
the Alibaba guy, yeah. I mean, the difference there that I see is that in terms of like uh process orientation, in terms of like, I know that the oligarchy, one of the key principles or constants of the oligarchy has been global population reduction. Like they're religiously committed to reducing the
Right.
population to like 1 billion, I think, or less. I mean, I think there's some dispute around computer models, and some say maybe 2 billion and some say 500 million. And so they have these like false debates around like, well, what number of death should we promote and world government to enforce that, as Bertrand Russell promoted world government for the same reason. What I'm just seeing when I look at the processes that have been unleashed in terms of anti-depopulation programs, from especially China with its nationally controlled banking system, it never, there was a big fight to privatize it, but it fought back against it. Is that there has been a pulling out of like nearly 1 billion people from poverty over 20 years, and a tendency towards
Sure.
like being able to like just do things that bring people into more states of knowledge and better quality of life and life expectancy, which just runs contrary in my thinking to the Malthusian doctrine of make people stupider and more poor. Like the West has lost 2 years on average under COVID. we've lost 2 years on average of life expectancy than we did in 2019,
Yeah.
and it's gonna get worse.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I think the Chinese are nationalist in that sense, but I don't think I think they can be nationalist and from at the leadership level, but still embrace like major parts of technocracy in the Great Reset.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
yeah, I agree. And no, it is a
Mhm.
it is a technocracy in that level, and like AI and stuff. All of these things are there's a fight over how it's gonna be used. Like, I don't think that a lot of these things are necessarily they're not saying like we're gonna destroy AI as a tech, or quantum computing as a tech or something like that, but there's a fight over like globalization 2.0 as Pepe Escobar calls it,
Mhm.
over, how will these things be used, and will they be used to make us all enslaved under feudalism and kill us, or will it be used in ways that can pull us out of poverty? I don't know to what degree you can do that with AI. I'm not too sure, but I think tech in general is a neutral thing. It's always ideology and intention, which makes it infuses it with morality or evil.
Yeah, I guess so, but then what about transhumanism, right? I don't really see that as benign. A
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. No, I hear what
technologies
you're
that
saying. Yeah,
sort of
transhumanism
get
is
into
poison.
human augmentation, because ultimately, as you know, and as I'm sure a decent amount of my audience knows, transhumanism is the new eugenics. I mean, the term was
Yeah,
coined by Julian Huxley, former head of the British Eugenics Society, and it's really
yeah,
gone from there. And that's also a technology that I would argue I personally don't see that as benign. I guess some applications of AI you could argue that, but really this, brave new world, to keep in the Huxleyan theme, that we're entering into with a lot of these technologies, I think are pretty tricky, in a sense of that of them, labeling them as neutral as, other revolutionary technologies of past eras. I think it gets a
yeah,
little complicated, but I do think that
yeah,
countries like Russia and China sort of see this as an opportunity to advance their own nation, but I think it's going to be at the expense. I don't think they're going to afford the same privileges of cultivating that technology for other countries' populations. They're gonna focus on advancing perhaps their own, national population, but I don't think it's, necessarily going to be great for, I don't know, for example, people in the US. I don't think the Chinese government is gonna, try and give them, AI, related privileges. I think that I think it's, we have to think about what that means in the context of nationalism,
yeah,
in
yeah,
those
yeah.
respective countries. I don't think it's in our interest. You
It
know?
is such a big philosophical issue that you're raising here, and it's true. I don't believe that transhumanism could ever be. I think it's intrinsically an ideology more than a technology. Even transhumanism is a belief that we can steer human evolution by a master class into a new phase of existence where we eliminate the useless eaters, and we can genetically modify and transform human beings by integrating humanity into machinery. And it has like all this AI ideology too that computers are ultimately going to supersede humanity because they can calculate faster and are thus better. Um, Keeping in mind that with a computer, it's like what goes in is what comes out. Like it's always defined, limited by what the programmers input into the computer's fundamental operating system. It can't like a computer can learn how to play chess better by a form of computer learning, but it cannot actually create a new and better game of chess. It can't do that. So these guys, again, they don't look at human creativity as a fundamental principle. They reject it and they treat it as an unnatural thing that has to be destroyed. In fact, because it's a threat to their stability, their existence. Every time we're creative and we introduce a new discovery, it upsets the thermodynamic stability that these control freaks at the top of the technocratic priesthood, they want absolute power and control, right? They don't like uncertainty. And a new discovery is something that creates resources that they didn't monopolize yet.
Yeah,
So
they
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 have to
don't
like
like random variables that come out of nowhere.
no, and
Mhm.
exactly. That's why ideas and discoveries, like how could a Da Vinci, who wasn't born from an elite family, come up with all of these different inventions and discoveries in medicine and music and astronomy and architecture and engineering, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not permitted to have those types of individuals arise who are really just actualizing their natural human potential. They're not wasting time, and they're coming to know their own souls. I think just nature as a being that's more than our flesh. and doing it with a moral and conscience intention. So all that to say, like, I think that with with the application of technology to human life, like, there's a limited amount of things that I think are possible. Like, we could maybe overcome like paralysis. People who are paraplegic could maybe have some form of tech in their brain that could help them activate and use their limbs or something, or maybe hereditary diseases. Maybe.
But that's also the selling point
I
these people,
know, I
transhumanists,
know.
use to get their stuff through the door, you
I
know?
find that the selling point has some feasibility to it, but it wouldn't be
Well,
transhumanism.
sure, but that's why it's the selling point.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be transhumanism. If you do that and you have a moral society that can utilize technology for the benefit of human beings instead of to suppress and enslave us, it wouldn't be transhumanism. It would still be like moral humanism that just makes life better. It wouldn't be transhumanism as such. So the transhumanism thing is a specific uh, evil satanic agenda to bring about this ideological utopia. It has all this other baggage associated with it.
Yeah, but the technologies that it talks about that are human augmentation are technologies specific to, I guess, transhumanism, the merging of man with machine, right? So I would argue those technologies aren't neutral. If you come from the position that it ultimately erodes what it means to be human, or as Klaus Schwab says, it changes what it means to be human, you know. But I would say it erodes it. You know, I'm definitely, I guess, biased.
That's coming from a guy like Klaus Schwab who doesn't he's not a human being as such. Like, I don't think he ever if you ask him to define what does humanity mean to you, he would have a really shit poor answer that would be super unsatisfying.
Well, that's why he probably doesn't get asked that question for a reason.
Or Yuval Harari, that creepy
Oh, I know. I've done a whole like 2 videos on him. I find him to be like king creep. And I don't know. He's really gifted in the sense that he can sort of linguistically make people think he's against something, but actually he's sort of promoting it.
well, he gets that from like H.G. Wells. He even says that H.G. Wells was his inspiration to be what he became, and that's what H.G. Wells does.
Fascinating.
Yeah. In all of his fiction work and nonfiction work, H.G. Wells sounds like he's criticizing nuclear war and all of these like terrible things that are bad, but in reality, he has this super evil intention the whole time. It's very sophisticated stuff.
Wow. Well, that's a great note to end it on, and talking about how the Fabians of years past continue to inform our future. For people that aren't familiar with my work on Harari, I did with Johnny Vedmore 2 videos called Dump Davos. Hopefully going to be turning that into a continuing series in the near future. But Harari's the guy that says humans are no longer spiritual beings. We are now hackable animals. He talks about the rise of data colonies and digital dictatorships, and how wearable technology is going to sort of facilitate that will cross a red line into digital dictatorships. And he frames himself as being against it. And then at the end, he's like, I think the people here at the World Economic Forum should take charge of these technologies so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And then he goes on to say the wrong hands are the hands of the rats. And he doesn't really explain who the rats are, but you sort of get from the tone that it's the people who aren't at the World Economic Forum, i.e., not the elite class, like regular people are the rats. And then the board of trustee member of the WEF, Oriet Gadesh, who's head of Bain and Capital, is like, oh, I agree that we can't let the rats have anything. And she literally says the rats like that, like the emphasis on it. It's just so weird how they talk. Anyway, I would recommend people go back and watch that video if they haven't already. The guy inspired by Fabian Society dude, H.G. Wells, pretty wild.
Aldous Huxley too, right? Read. If anyone's listening and you want something really, really interesting to read that gives you a lot of insight into this, is Brave New World Revisited by Aldous Huxley. And Aldous was also my wife Cynthia Chung. She's also a writer for the Strategic Culture Foundation, and she's just doing a series on this. It's going to become a book soon on how Aldous Huxley was himself also a Fabian. I didn't even know that. He was recruited at Eton. And if you read his Brave New World Revisited, it sounds like he's warning us of all of these bad things that'll happen with social engineers if we're not careful. But if you look at what he's doing and what he even admits to in the Brave New World Revisited 10 years later, he's completely enthusiastically a part of that process that is bringing us into this Mustafa Moon type of weird test tube baby world of alphas and gammas and soma and all. He loves it. He's one of the godfather of the LSD culture. He recruited Timothy Leary.
Wild. This is definitely one of the longer podcasts I've done in a while, so I probably have to wrap it up here. But thanks so much, Matthew, for your time and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with my listeners. Very much appreciated. I think we often forget the role that history and this period of time you were going over still has shaped so much of our present situation. So I really appreciate you coming on. Can you let people know where they can follow your work and support you?
Most certainly, and thank you for having me on. They can support my work. I guess the easiest thing would be to go to CanadianPatriot.org. You could also buy my books, easy to find there. RisingTideFoundation.net is a nonprofit I co-run with my wife. There's weekly events that we host, lectures, other things. So there's a lot of content there, and also my Substack, which is MatthewEhret.substack.com. I'm not assuming you can know how to read that, so maybe anyway. You'll go to CanadianPatriot.org is the easiest, though.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Matthew, and thanks so much to everyone listening. A special thank you to people who support this podcast and who get to listen to the podcast first for a couple days until it becomes publicly available. So if you're interested in getting early access to this podcast, be sure to support. We really appreciate it. But, of course, this becomes publicly available to everyone and on all podcasting apps after the fact. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much, and catch you next time.